When you've lost everything that mattered, sometimes the only thing left to trust is an old dog. Eli Mercer thought he knew every story his Wyoming ranch could tell. For 30 years, Eli has lived quietly with aging companion Dusty, both carrying memories. When a strange lump appears on Dusty's leg, Eli assumes it's just time catching up. But when the lump ruptures, it reveals something impossible, a rusted object buried in the dog's flesh. What starts as simple concern becomes a mystery reaching back decades, threatening to unearth secrets about land Eli's late wife died protecting. The object holds clues to a crime never solved, and Dusty may be the only witness left. What exactly has this faithful dog been carrying all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of the weathered ranch house, casting long shadows across the pine table where Eli Mercer sat with his coffee growing cold. At 68, his hands showed the map of decades, calloused palms, scars from barbed wire, and fingers that had gentled countless horses and mended more fence than any man should in one lifetime. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of Sarah's grandmother's clock and the soft wheeze of Dusty's breathing from his place by the wood stove. Dusty raised his grizzled head, brown eyes still sharp despite his 12 years. The dog had been Sarah's idea, back when they still believed they had time for everything: children, travel, all those dreams that seem so possible when you're young and the world feels manageable. Now Dusty was the last living connection to those days, a bridge between the life Eli had lived with Sarah and the quiet existence he'd carved out in her absence. The ranch stretched out beyond the window, 3,000 acres of high plains country where the wind never seemed to rest. Sarah had inherited it from her father, old Henrik Larsen, a Norwegian immigrant who'd claimed this land when it still felt like the edge of the world. The house itself told stories in its weathered boards and settled foundation, stories of harsh winters, drought years, and the kind of hope that kept farmers and ranchers believing in tomorrow despite what yesterday had brought. Eli remembered the first time he'd seen this place, 35 years ago, when Sarah brought him home to meet her father. He'd been working construction then, following jobs from Montana down to Colorado, thinking himself too restless for the kind of life that tied a man to one piece of ground. But something about the way the morning light caught the grassland, the way Sarah moved through the house like she belonged to it, and it to her, had made him understand what home could mean. Henrik had been skeptical of the young man his daughter brought around. Fair enough. Eli had shown up in worn jeans and work boots, driving a truck held together more by hope than engineering. But the old Norwegian had set him to work mending fence, and by the end of that first week, something had settled between them. Perhaps it was the way Eli never complained about the early mornings, or the way he listened when Henrik talked about the land, really listened, like those stories mattered. "This ground has memory," Henrik had said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky red and gold. "It remembers every person who worked it, every drop of sweat, every prayer for rain. You take care of it, it takes care of you. But you can't fool it. The land knows if you belong or if you're just passing through." Eli had married Sarah the following spring, right there in the front yard with wildflowers blooming and the whole county in attendance. Henrik had walked his daughter down between 2 rows of cottonwood trees he'd planted when Sarah was born, their leaves whispering in the wind like a blessing. That night, in the little house Henrik had built for them just up the ridge from the main ranch house, Sarah had shown Eli the faded family photograph that would become one of his most treasured possessions. The photograph sat now on the mantel above the stone fireplace, its edges soft with age and handling. In it, Sarah stood beside her father in front of the barn, both of them squinting into the sun, Henrik's hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. She couldn't have been more than 16 then, already showing the quiet strength that would define her, the way she could gentle a spooked horse or face down a creditor with equal grace. Henrik looked proud and weathered, The kind of man who'd earned every line on his face. Those had been good years, the kind that pass too quickly when you're living them. Eli learned the rhythms of ranch life, this endless cycle of feeding, mending, planning, and hoping. He discovered he had a natural feel for livestock, could read weather patterns almost as well as Henrik, and found satisfaction in work that left him bone-tired but content. Sarah managed the books and the garden, taught at the one-room schoolhouse down in Clearwater Valley 2 days a week, and somehow made their small house feel like the center of the universe. They'd tried for children, hoped and planned and grieved the losses that came. Sarah never spoke of it as tragedy, just as life taking its own course, but Eli knew the empty rooms upstairs weighed on her. They talked about adoption, made inquiries, but somehow other things always seemed to get in the way. A bad year for cattle, Henrik's heart attack that left him weakened, the constant demands of keeping a ranch running. Then the trouble started. It began slowly, the way most disasters do. First, there were surveys being done on neighboring properties, men in clean trucks with instruments and clipboards who spoke in technical terms about mineral rights and development potential. Then came the letters from lawyers representing investment companies, with names like Pinnacle Development and Western Resource Holdings. They wanted to buy land, they said, for fair market value, plus a premium. Most of the older ranchers took the money and moved to town or to be closer to their children in the cities, but not Henrik, and not Sarah. The old Norwegian had lived through the Depression, had seen what happened when the land fell into the wrong hands. "They'll strip it," he told Eli one evening, as they watched another neighbor's cattle being loaded onto trucks for the last time. "Take what they want and leave the bones. This land has supported families for generations. It deserves better." Sarah felt the same way, with the fierce protectiveness of someone whose roots went deep. She started attending county meetings, researching property law, building alliances with the few remaining ranchers who shared their concerns. Eli supported her, of course, but in truth, he sometimes wondered if they were fighting a war already lost. The offers kept coming, each one larger than the last, and the pressure from various companies grew more persistent. Henrik died on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly in his sleep, as if he'd simply decided it was time to go. They buried him in the small cemetery overlooking the valley, next to his wife Anna, with half the county in attendance despite a late-season snowstorm. Sarah inherited everything: the land, the house, the debt, and the mounting legal pressure from companies that seemed to know exactly how vulnerable a young widow might be. That's when things got serious. The friendly letters stopped, replaced by legal documents and veiled threats. Someone filed a claim, suggesting irregularities in the original land grant from Henrik's grandfather. Survey markers went missing. Fences were cut. Sarah's truck tires were slashed twice in town. She started carrying her father's old rifle when she rode out to check cattle, and she made Eli promise to do the same. "They want us scared," she told him one night as they sat on the porch, listening to coyotes calling from the ridge. "Fear makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise consider. But this land is ours, Eli, not just legally, it's part of us. You can't let them take it." The last time Eli saw his wife alive, she was heading out early to check on a section of fence near the old mining claim on the North 40. It was September, one of those crystalline autumn mornings when the air felt sharp enough to cut. She'd kissed him goodbye, scratched Dusty behind the ears, and driven off in her pickup with that determined set to her shoulders he'd come to know well. They found her truck that evening, rolled down an embankment near Devil's Canyon, Sarah trapped inside. The sheriff ruled it an accident, said she must have taken the curve too fast, maybe swerved to avoid a deer. But Eli knew better. Sarah had driven that road 1,000 times. She knew every rock, every turn, every place where the shoulder dropped away, but knowing and proving were different things, especially when the investigation seemed unusually brief and the sheriff unusually eager to close the case. Within a month, the legal pressure on Eli intensified. More letters, more offers, more suggestions that perhaps it would be easier to sell and start fresh somewhere else. Sarah was gone, and with her much of his will to fight. He'd stayed, though, 30 years of staying, of working the land, and keeping Sarah's memory alive in every fence mended and every sunrise witnessed from the kitchen window. Dusty had been a puppy then, a gift from a neighbor who thought Eli needed company. The dog had grown up learning the rhythms of their solitary life, morning chores, long days working cattle, evenings on the porch, watching the stars emerge. Now Dusty was old, moving more slowly, spending more time sleeping by the stove. Eli had been dreading the inevitable, the day when his last companion would leave him truly alone. So, when he'd noticed the lump on Dusty's rear leg 3 weeks ago, he'd told himself it was just age, just one more thing time was stealing from him. But this morning, when the lump had burst open to reveal not infection, but something else entirely, something that made no sense, Eli felt the world shift beneath his feet like ice cracking on a pond. The small, rusted object he'd cleaned and wrapped in a dish towel sat now on the kitchen table, innocent-looking but somehow ominous. He picked up the faded photograph from the mantel, studying Sarah's young face, her father's protective stance. They'd both died defending this land, Hendrik from exhaustion and heartbreak, Sarah from something far more sinister. And now, after 30 years of silence, the ground itself seemed to be giving up its secrets. Dusty whimpered softly in his sleep, perhaps dreaming of younger days when his legs were strong and his purpose clear. Eli set the photograph back in its place and looked out at the vast expanse of his land, Sarah's land, ground that had memory and secrets and stories yet to tell. Whatever this rusted object meant, whatever it might reveal, Eli knew his quiet days were ending. The past had found him again, and this time he wouldn't let it go without answers. The object didn't look like much. After Eli cleaned away the dried blood and tissue, barely larger than a quarter, made of what appeared to be brass or bronze, green with age and corrosion. He'd set it on a towel under the kitchen lamp, squinting at it through the reading glasses Sarah had convinced him to get the year before she died. His eyes weren't what they used to be, but he could make out numbers etched into the metal, 1994, and below that what looked like coordinates. Dusty lay at his feet, the wound on his leg cleaned and bandaged. The veterinarian in town was 3 hours away, and at Dusty's age, Eli wasn't sure the stress of the trip would be worth it. The bleeding had stopped, and the dog seemed more comfortable now, though he kept watching Eli with those knowing eyes, as if he understood the significance of what had been hidden in his flesh. Eli turned the object over in his weathered hands, feeling its weight, substantial for something so small. Along one edge, he could make out letters partially obscured by corrosion, U.S., and what might have been survey. His heart began to beat faster. He knew what this was, or what it had once been part of. A surveyor's marker, the kind used to establish property boundaries and mineral claims. The date made his chest tighten. 1994, the year before Sarah died. The year the pressure from the development companies had intensified. The year strange men had appeared on neighboring properties with their instruments and their questions about mineral rights. He pushed back from the table and walked to the window, looking out at his land that had been surveyed and resurveyed more times than he could count in recent decades. Each time, the reports had come back the same. The Larson Ranch contained no significant mineral deposits, nothing worth the cost of extraction. That's what had made Sarah's stubbornness seem almost quaint to some people. Why fight so hard for land that wasn't worth fighting for? But what if those reports had been wrong? Or worse, what if they'd been deliberately falsified? Eli's mind drifted back to the months before Sarah's death, details he'd buried under 30 years of grief and guilt. She'd been suspicious of the surveys, had questioned why the companies kept insisting on new ones when previous reports had shown nothing of value. She'd started asking for copies of all documentation, had even hired an independent surveyor to verify the findings. Something doesn't add up. Eli, she'd told him one evening as they sat at this same kitchen table, papers spread between them like a losing hand of cards. Why would 3 different companies spend this much money trying to buy land that their own surveys say is worthless? And why are they so insistent about the North 40, specifically that area near the old mining claim? The North 40, the section where Sarah had been found. Her truck rolled down the embankment near Devil's Canyon. The area where, according to this marker, someone had been surveying in 1994. Eli returned to the table and picked up the object again, this time using a magnifying glass from Sarah's sewing basket. Under the stronger magnification, more details emerged. The coordinates were clearer now, and they corresponded to the area near Devil's Canyon. But there was something else, a small symbol etched into the metal that made his blood run cold. It was a mine shaft symbol, the universal mark used on geological surveys to indicate underground workings or potential extraction sites. Below it, barely visible through the corrosion, he could make out what looked like chemical symbols: Au, Ag, Q, gold, silver, copper. The room seemed to spin around him. Sarah had been right. The land did contain valuable mineral deposits, substantial enough to warrant the kind of pressure they'd experienced. And someone had known about it all along, someone who'd been willing to kill to keep the secret buried. He thought about Dusty, about how the dog had favored that leg for years, long before the visible lump had appeared. How old would Dusty have been in 1994? Still a puppy, barely a year old, full of energy and curiosity. The kind of dog who might investigate strange men with equipment, might get close enough to be seen as a problem. Eli's hands shook as he set down the magnifying glass. Had someone tried to kill his dog 30 years ago? Had Dusty been shot? The bullet carrying this marker deep into his flesh, where it had remained hidden all these years, slowly working its way to the surface like some kind of metallic splinter. He walked to the kitchen drawer, where Sarah had kept important papers, though he'd barely looked at them since her death. Most of it was ranch business, veterinary records, feed receipts, tax documents, but at the bottom, wrapped in a rubber band, were the papers related to the survey disputes. His hands felt clumsy as he untied the band and spread the documents across the table. There it was, the independent survey Sarah had commissioned in the summer of 1994. The surveyor's name was James Morrison, and his report was thorough and damning. According to Morrison's findings, the North 40 showed clear signs of significant mineral deposits, primarily gold and silver, with substantial copper veins running through the underground limestone formations. The estimated value was in the millions, enough to make the Larson Ranch one of the most valuable properties in the county. Eli felt sick. Sarah had died, protecting land worth a fortune, land that the development companies had known about all along. The official surveys, the ones that showed no mineral value, had been lies designed to keep the property values artificially low, but there was more in the papers. A letter from Morrison, dated just 2 weeks before Sarah's accident, expressing concern about threats he'd received. Someone had broken into his office, stolen equipment, warned him to stay away from the Larson property. The letter recommended that Sarah contact federal authorities, suggested that local law enforcement might be compromised. Sarah had never received that letter. It was still in its envelope, unopened, filed with the other papers. She died before Morrison could warn her how much danger she was really in. Eli sat heavily in his chair, the weight of 30 years of ignorance crushing down on him. He'd spent 3 decades accepting Sarah's death as a tragic accident, mourning her loss while living on land that killers had died for. He'd been a fool, blind to the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. Dusty whimpered and struggled to his feet, moving slowly to Eli's side. The old dog pressed against his leg, offering comfort in the way dogs do, unconditional and wordless. Eli reached down to stroke Dusty's head, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than resignation. Anger, slow and hot, began to build in his chest. They'd killed Sarah for money, for mineral rights that should have made her family wealthy instead of dead. They'd corrupted local officials, falsified reports, and when Sarah had gotten too close to the truth, they'd murdered her and made it look like an accident. But they'd made one mistake. They'd left a witness. Eli looked down at Dusty, understanding now why the dog had survived for so many years with a piece of evidence literally embedded in his flesh. Some cosmic justice had kept that marker hidden, waiting for the right moment to surface, waiting for a time when Eli might be ready to face the truth and do something about it. The old surveyor's marker sat on the table like an accusation, its presence transforming everything Eli thought he knew about his life, his loss, and his land. For 30 years, he'd been living a lie, accepting a narrative that painted him as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. Now he knew better. Sarah hadn't died in an accident. She'd been murdered by people who'd stolen her birthright and gotten away with it. And somewhere out there, those people were still free, still profiting from their crimes, still believing their secret was safe. But secrets, like truth, had a way of surfacing eventually. The land had memory, Henrik had always said. It remembered every person who worked it, every drop of sweat, every injustice committed on its soil. Now it was time for the land to remember Sarah, and for Eli to make sure justice finally had its day. Sleep eluded Eli that night. He lay in the bed he'd shared with Sarah, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods outside their bedroom window. Every sound seemed amplified. The settling of the old house, Dusty's restless movements downstairs, the distant call of an owl hunting in the darkness. His mind churned through possibilities and implications, each more disturbing than the last. When dawn finally broke grey and uncertain through the windows, Eli was already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with his first cup of coffee. The surveyor's marker sat before him, no longer just a curious object, but evidence of a crime that had shaped the last 30 years of his life. Dusty watched him from his place by the stove, brown eyes alert despite the early hour, as if the dog sensed that something fundamental had changed. After feeding Dusty and checking his bandaged leg, Eli made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, something he rarely did anymore. The upper level of the house held too many memories. The bedroom they'd prepared for children who never came. The small office where Sarah had managed the ranch accounts and fought their legal battles. Sarah's office remained exactly as she'd left it the morning she died. Eli had closed the door that first week after the funeral and hadn't opened it since. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight that streamed through windows, clouded with years of neglect. The desk still held her coffee cup, a ceramic mug decorated with wildflowers that she'd used every morning. Her reading glasses lay folded beside a stack of papers, waiting for eyes that would never return to them. The sight of it, so ordinary, so heartbreakingly normal, nearly broke his resolve. For a moment, he considered retreating downstairs, leaving the past undisturbed. But the weight of the surveyor's marker in his pocket reminded him that the past had already been disturbed, had been working its way to the surface for 30 years, like a splinter seeking light. He sat in Sarah's chair, a simple wooden piece that creaked under his weight, and began methodically going through her papers. Most of it was familiar. Ranch records, correspondence with feed suppliers, veterinary bills. But as he worked deeper into the desk drawers, he found materials he'd never seen before. Files Sarah had kept separate from the routine business of running the ranch. The first folder contained correspondence with various lawyers, some from as far away as Denver and Cheyenne. The letters detailed a pattern of questionable land acquisitions throughout the county, properties purchased at below-market prices from families facing financial pressure or legal challenges. The same names appeared repeatedly: Pinnacle Development, Western Resource Holdings, and a law firm called Blackstone and Associates. But it was the handwritten letter at the bottom of the folder that made Eli's blood run cold. Written on personal stationery in careful script, it was signed by someone named Margaret Hawthorne, Esquire, from a firm in Casper. The date was September 10, 1995, just 5 days before Sarah's death. "Dear Mrs. Mercer," the letter began, "I'm writing to warn you of serious irregularities we have discovered in the property transfers affecting your area." Our investigation suggests a coordinated effort to acquire mineral-rich lands through fraudulent means, including falsified geological surveys, intimidation of property owners, and possible corruption of local officials. Eli's hands trembled as he read further. The letter detailed specific instances of coercion and fraud, describing how elderly ranchers had been pressured into selling their land for fractions of its true value. It mentioned the disappearance of James Morrison, the independent surveyor Sarah had hired, and suggested that local law enforcement might be compromised. "I strongly urge you to contact federal authorities immediately," the letter continued. "The people behind this operation have demonstrated a willingness to use violence to protect their interests. Your husband and property may be in immediate danger. I've prepared copies of all relevant documentation for the FBI, but you must be the one to initiate contact. Trust no one in local government." The letter was signed with a flourish, followed by a postscript that chilled Eli to the bone. "If anything happens to me before we can meet, look for the evidence in the old mine shaft on your north property." James Morrison hid materials there before he disappeared. "The truth must not die with us." Eli set the letter down with shaking hands. Margaret Hawthorne. He remembered that name now, though he'd pushed the memory away for 3 decades. She'd been found dead in her office 2 weeks after Sarah's accident, an apparent suicide, according to the newspapers. No note, no explanation. Just a successful lawyer who'd supposedly decided to end her life for no apparent reason. 3 people who'd known the truth about the mineral surveys. Morrison, Hawthorne and Sarah, all dead within a month of each other. The odds of that being coincidental were astronomical. Eli continued searching through Sarah's papers, finding more evidence of the conspiracy she'd uncovered. There were maps showing the network of properties that had been acquired, financial records suggesting the true value of the mineral deposits, and correspondence with other ranchers who'd been pressured to sell. Sarah had been building a comprehensive case, gathering evidence that could have brought down the entire operation. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in an old pillowcase, he found Sarah's personal journal from her final months. Her handwriting, usually neat and precise, grew increasingly urgent as the entries progressed. She wrote about strange cars following her in town, phone calls with no one on the other end, and her growing certainty that their property was being watched. The final entry, dated the day before her death, made Eli's throat tighten with emotion. "I know they're planning something. Eli thinks I'm being paranoid, but I can feel it closing in. If something happens to me, I pray he'll have the strength to finish what I started. The land is everything, not just to us, but to everyone who came before and everyone who might come after. I won't let them steal our heritage for their greed." Below that, in different ink as if added later, "I've hidden copies of everything in the place only Eli would think to look. Dusty knows the way." Dusty. Eli looked toward the stairs, where he could hear the dog moving restlessly below. Had Sarah trained Dusty to lead him somewhere? Was that why the dog had carried the surveyor's marker in his flesh all these years, not as the result of an attack, but as a deliberate sign, a message Sarah had somehow arranged? The implications were staggering. If Sarah had known she was in danger, if she'd prepared for the possibility of her death, then her accident was definitely murder. And somewhere on their property, she'd hidden evidence that could finally bring her killers to justice. Eli gathered the papers and journal, his movements quick and decisive despite his 78 years. For 3 decades, he'd lived in the shadow of his wife's death, accepting it as a tragic end to their story. Now he understood it had been the beginning of something else entirely, a quest for justice that Sarah had started and he would finish. Downstairs, Dusty was waiting by the door, tail wagging despite his injured leg. The dog's eyes held an intelligence that Eli had always recognized but never fully appreciated. How much did Dusty remember? How much had Sarah taught him in those final days when she'd sensed danger closing in? There was only one way to find out. Eli folded Margaret Hawthorne's letter and placed it in his shirt pocket next to the surveyor's marker. Two pieces of evidence, 30 years apart, both pointing toward the same terrible truth. Sarah had died protecting secrets that could destroy powerful people. Now those secrets were fighting their way to the surface, demanding recognition and justice. And Eli, despite his age and his fear, was the only one left who could give them voice. The Clearwater Valley Public Library hadn't changed much in 30 years. The same oak tables where Sarah had once prepared her lesson plans for the schoolhouse still lined the main reading room, and the familiar scent of old books and floor wax brought back memories that felt both comforting and painful. Eli hadn't been inside the building since Sarah's funeral, when half the town had gathered to pay their respects to a woman who'd taught many of their children. Behind the circulation desk sat Dorothy Chen, the head librarian who'd been Sarah's friend and occasional confidant. Dorothy had aged gracefully into her 70s, her silver hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for decades. She looked up as Eli approached, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine surprise. "Eli Mercer," she said, setting down her stamping pad. "It's been far too long. What brings you to town?" "Research," Eli replied, feeling awkward in the formal space after so many years of solitude. "I need to look at old newspapers, Dorothy. September 1995, specifically." Dorothy's expression grew curious, but concerned. "That's around the time Sarah—" "Yes," Eli interrupted gently. "I need to see what was written about her accident." Dorothy studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "The newspaper archives are on microfilm in the back room. Would you like me to help you find what you're looking for?" The microfilm reader was an ancient machine that Dorothy operated with practiced efficiency, threading the film and adjusting the focus until the pages of the Clearwater Valley Tribune appeared on the screen. The newspaper had been a weekly publication then, serving the scattered communities throughout the county with local news, obituaries, and agricultural reports. The headline appeared on the front page of the September 23, 1995 edition. "Local rancher killed in highway accident." Below it was a photograph of Sarah that Eli remembered from their wedding announcement, her smile bright and confident. The sight of it made his chest tighten with a grief that felt as fresh as it had 30 years ago. But as Eli read the article, details emerged that didn't match his memories of that terrible day. According to the reporter, Sarah's truck had been found at 6:30 in the evening by a passing motorist. The vehicle had apparently skidded off the highway near Devil's Canyon, rolling down a steep embankment and crushing the cab. The sheriff's department had responded to the scene, and Sarah had been pronounced dead at 7:15 p.m. Eli frowned. The timeline was wrong. He'd called the sheriff's office to report Sarah missing at 3 p.m. when she failed to return from checking the North 40. The dispatcher had taken his information but seemed unconcerned, saying that ranchers often got delayed by unexpected problems. When they'd finally organized a search party, it was nearly dark. But according to this article, the accident had been discovered by chance, not through an active search. And the description of the crash site didn't match what Eli remembered seeing. The newspaper described Sarah's truck as having skidded off the highway, but Eli distinctly recalled thinking at the time that she'd been driving the ranch road that paralleled the highway, not the highway itself. "Dorothy," he said, "do you remember Sarah's accident? Were you here when it happened?" Dorothy nodded, her expression growing sad. "Of course. It was such a shock to everyone. Sarah was always so careful, especially on those mountain roads. She'd driven them her whole life. Do you remember hearing about how it was discovered? Who found her?" Dorothy paused, concentrating. "I believe it was that new deputy. What was his name?" "Mitchell, I think. Michael Mitchell. He was making rounds and noticed skid marks on the highway. Very observant of him, people said. Such a tragedy that even his quick response couldn't save her. Michael Mitchell." Eli didn't recognize the name, but that wasn't unusual. The sheriff's department had grown significantly in the years before Sarah's death, adding several new deputies as the county's population increased. But something about the story bothered him. If Mitchell had been making routine rounds, Why had it taken until evening to discover an accident that had supposedly happened much earlier? Dorothy, could you help me find other newspapers from that time period? I'd like to look at the months before and after September. For the next 2 hours, Dorothy helped Eli scroll through microfilm, searching for any mention of the land disputes, mining claims, or suspicious deaths that might be connected to Sarah's case. What they found painted a disturbing picture of a community under pressure. In July 1995, a rancher named Tom Bradley had died in what was described as a hunting accident. Bradley had owned property adjacent to the old mining claims, and according to a brief mention in an August edition, his widow had sold the ranch to Pinnacle Development within weeks of his death. In October, just a month after Sarah's accident, an elderly woman named Ruth Kensington had died in her home of an apparent heart attack. The obituary mentioned that she'd been fighting a legal battle over mineral rights on her deceased husband's property. Her children, living out of state, had sold the land to Western Resource Holdings before Thanksgiving. 3 deaths in 4 months, all property owners who'd been resisting development pressure. The newspaper treated each as an isolated tragedy, but when viewed together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Dorothy printed copies of the relevant articles without being asked, her expression growing more troubled as the scope of the pattern became clear. When Eli finally pushed back from the microfilm reader, she was waiting with a folder containing everything they'd found. "Eli," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something. Something I probably should have said 30 years ago." Eli looked up at her, seeing the weight of old secrets in her eyes. "The day before Sarah died, she came here to use our photocopier. She had boxes of documents, surveys, letters, legal papers. She spent hours copying everything, making multiple sets. When I asked if there was anything I could help with, she said she was creating insurance policies." Dorothy paused, glancing around the empty library as if checking for eavesdroppers. "She gave me a sealed envelope that day, told me to keep it safe and only open it if something happened to her. I thought she was being dramatic. You know how seriously she took everything. But after the accident, you still have the envelope. I kept it in my desk drawer for 5 years, then moved it to the library's safe deposit box at the bank. I always told myself I was being foolish, that it was probably just copies of insurance papers or something mundane. But lately, with all the development happening around here, I've been wondering if I should have opened it years ago." Eli felt his pulse quicken. "Dorothy, I think Sarah left that envelope for a reason. I think she knew she was in danger." Dorothy nodded slowly. "The bank closes at 4, but I could call the president. Jim Morrison, he's James Morrison's nephew, the surveyor who disappeared around that same time. I think he'd understand the urgency." James Morrison's nephew. Another connection in a web of relationships that seemed to center around the events of 5. Eli wondered how many other people in Clearwater Valley knew more than they'd ever said about what had really happened that autumn. "Dorothy, would you be willing to help me get that envelope? And would you be willing to talk to someone about what you remember from that time?" She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded with the determination of someone who'd carried a burden for too long. "Sarah was my friend, Eli. If someone hurt her, if all of this is connected, then it's time the truth came out." As they prepared to leave the library, Dorothy handed him the newspaper clipping about Sarah's accident. "Keep this," she said. "But Eli, be careful. If you're right about what happened, then the people responsible are still out there. They've had 30 years to cover their tracks and build their power. Don't let them know you're asking questions until you're ready to act on the answers." Eli folded the clipping and placed it in his pocket with the surveyor's marker and Margaret Hawthorne's letter. 3 pieces of evidence, each pointing toward the same conclusion. Sarah hadn't died in an accident. She'd been murdered by people who'd thought they could bury the truth along with their victims. But the truth, like water seeking its own level, had a way of finding the surface eventually. And after 30 years of silence, Eli was finally ready to listen to what it had to say. The county courthouse in Rawlings had been built in the 1920s, its red brick facade and tall windows reflecting an era when public buildings were designed to inspire confidence in government institutions. As Eli climbed the worn marble steps, he wondered how many secrets these walls had witnessed, how many official lies had been recorded in the documents stored within. The records office occupied the basement, a maze of filing cabinets and storage boxes presided over by a clerk who looked barely old enough to drive. The young man, his nameplate read Kevin Martinez, seemed surprised to have a visitor, especially one asking for mining permits and mineral rights documentation from the 1990s. Most people just want birth certificates or property deeds, Kevin said as he led Eli through rows of cabinets. Mining permits are kind of specialized. Are you doing research for a book or something? Something like that, Eli replied, not wanting to complicate the conversation with explanations he wasn't ready to share. Kevin pulled several thick folders from a cabinet marked 1999 Mining Mineral Rights and deposited them on a table near the window. These are all the applications filed during that decade. Fair warning, it's pretty dry stuff. Mostly geological surveys and environmental impact assessments. Left alone with the documents, Eli began methodically working through the files. Most were routine applications for exploratory drilling or small-scale gravel operations, the kind of minor resource extraction that provided modest income for rural landowners. But halfway through the third folder, he found something that made his blood run cold. The application was dated March 15, 1994. Filed by Western Resource Holdings for a comprehensive mineral extraction permit covering nearly 10,000 acres in the Devil's Canyon area. The scope was massive, gold, silver, and copper extraction with projected operations lasting 25 years. The estimated value of recoverable minerals was listed as $47 million. $47 million. Eli read the number twice, certain he'd misunderstood. But there it was, typed on official forms with engineering assessments and geological surveys attached. The application included detailed maps showing exactly which properties would be affected, and the Larson Ranch sat at the center of the proposed operation. According to the documentation, Western Resource Holdings had already secured agreements from most of the affected landowners. Property after property was listed as acquisition pending or owner consent obtained. Only 3 properties showed negotiation in progress: the Larson Ranch, the Bradley property, and Ruth Kensington's homestead. Eli remembered those names from the newspaper articles Dorothy had shown him. Tom Bradley, dead in a hunting accident. Ruth Kensington, dead of a heart attack. And Sarah, dead in a car crash. All within months of this permit application moving forward. But what struck him most was the thoroughness of the geological surveys attached to the application. These weren't the simplified reports that had been shown to property owners. These were comprehensive analyses detailing the exact location and value of mineral deposits. The North 40 of Eli's ranch was identified as containing the richest concentration of gold ore in the entire area. Someone had lied to them. For years, Sarah had been told that their land contained no significant mineral deposits. The surveys provided to landowners had been falsified, designed to keep property values artificially low, while the real surveys, the ones in this file, mapped out a fortune in precious metals. Eli photocopied the entire permit application, his hand shaking with anger and disbelief. $47 million. That's what his wife had died for, not the land itself, but the treasure buried beneath it. As he prepared to leave the courthouse, Eli encountered someone he recognized in the hallway outside the records office. Frank Morrison sat on a bench near the elevator, his sheriff's uniform replaced by civilian clothes, but his bearing still unmistakably that of a lawman. Frank had been the sheriff when Sarah died, though he'd retired within a year of her death. Now in his 80s, he looked frail but alert. Eli Mercer, Frank said, rising slowly to his feet. I heard you were asking questions around town. Dorothy Chen called me after you left the library yesterday. Eli studied the old sheriff's face, trying to read his intentions. Just trying to understand some things about Sarah's death that never made sense to me. Frank nodded, his expression grave. "Walk with me. There are things we should discuss, but not here." They left the courthouse together, Frank moving with the careful steps of someone whose joints protested every movement. He led Eli to a small park across the street, where they settled on a bench beneath an old cottonwood tree. "I've been carrying guilt about your wife's case for 30 years, Frank began without preamble. "I knew the investigation was rushed, knew there were questions that weren't being asked. But I was 2 years from retirement, and the pressure to close the case was significant." "What kind of pressure?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, watching pigeons peck at scattered crumbs near their feet. "The kind that comes from people with more power than a small-town sheriff. Phone calls from politicians in Cheyenne, visits from men in expensive suits who never identified themselves, but made it clear that a quick resolution was in everyone's best interest. You knew it wasn't an accident." "I suspected it wasn't. The physical evidence at the scene didn't match the story we were told to tell. Sarah's truck had been moved after the initial impact. You could see the drag marks in the dirt, and the damage pattern suggested she'd been hit by another vehicle before going over the embankment." Eli felt the anger building in his chest. 30 years of suppressed suspicion, finally finding validation. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you fight for the truth?" Frank turned to look at him directly, his eyes reflecting the weight of old regrets. "Because they made it clear that fighting would be dangerous, not just for me, but for my family. My grandson was 5 years old then, Eli. When men start talking about accidents that could happen to children, you listen." The old sheriff reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age. "I kept copies of everything. The real crime scene photos, the evidence that was never submitted, witness statements that were never followed up on. I told myself someday I'd find the courage to do something with it all." He handed the envelope to Eli. "I'm 83 years old and my courage hasn't improved with age. But maybe yours has." Eli opened the envelope and found himself looking at photographs that showed a very different scene than the one described in the newspaper. Sarah's truck bore impact damage on the driver's side that suggested a collision before the rollover. Skid marks on the ranch road indicated she'd tried to avoid something or someone. And there, partially hidden in the grass near the crash site, was what looked like fragments of blue paint that didn't match Sarah's red pickup. "There was another vehicle involved," Frank explained. "Someone forced her off the road, then pushed her truck over the embankment to make it look like an accident. We found tire impressions from a heavy truck or SUV, but the scene was trampled by so many people that the evidence was compromised." "Do you know who did it?" Frank shook his head. "I had suspicions, but no proof. What I can tell you is that the investigation was shut down by order of the state attorney general's office within 72 hours. Unusual for what was supposed to be a simple traffic fatality." Eli stared at the photographs, evidence that his wife had been murdered deliberately and systematically covered up by people who were supposed to seek justice. The permit application in his coat pocket took on new significance. $47 million was enough motive to kill anyone who stood in the way. "Frank, there's something you need to know. Sarah wasn't just fighting to keep the ranch. She was sitting on a gold mine, literally. The mineral surveys she was shown were fakes. The real surveys show deposits worth tens of millions." The old sheriff's face went pale. "Jesus, that explains the pressure, the threats, the whole rush to close the case. They weren't just stealing land, they were stealing a fortune." "Who's they?" "Who had the power to order you to stop investigating?" Frank looked around the park, checking for anyone who might overhear their conversation. The permits would have required approval from the State Mining Commission. The State Attorney General's office handled the legal challenges. And locally, he paused, his expression pained. "Mike Mitchell, my deputy who supposedly found Sarah's truck, he was the nephew of someone high up in Pinnacle Development." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. A network of corruption that reached from local law enforcement to state government, all designed to facilitate the theft of mineral-rich land from unsuspecting property owners. Sarah had stumbled onto something massive, and she died for it. Frank, who's still alive? Who was part of this? Who can we hold accountable? The old sheriff stood slowly, his joints creaking audibly. That's the question, isn't it? 30 years is a long time, Eli. Some people have died, some have moved away, some have probably convinced themselves they were just following orders. But the companies are still around, still operating under different names. And the profits, well, those have been flowing for 3 decades. As Frank prepared to leave, he placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. Be careful, son. These people killed your wife when she got too close to the truth. They won't hesitate to kill again if they think you're a threat. And remember, they've had 30 years to cover their tracks and build their defenses. You're going to need more than old evidence and moral outrage to bring them down. Eli watched the old sheriff walk away, then looked down at the photographs in his hands. Evidence of murder, covered up by corrupt officials and buried under decades of silence. But not completely buried. Never completely buried. The truth had a way of preserving itself, of finding people willing to carry it forward when the time was right. And after 30 years of waiting, Eli finally understood that the time had come. The current sheriff's office occupied a modern building on the outskirts of Rawlings, all glass and steel that projected efficiency and authority. Eli sat in his truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes, studying the building and gathering his courage. He'd driven here directly from his meeting with Frank Morrison, the old sheriff's evidence burning like a coal in his jacket pocket. Michael Mitchell, the same deputy who'd supposedly discovered Sarah's accident, was now Sheriff Mitchell, according to the sign beside the main entrance. 30 years of climbing the ranks, built on a foundation of corruption and murder. Eli wondered how many other crimes had been covered up or manipulated during Mitchell's rise to power. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, directed Eli to Sheriff Mitchell's office after announcing his arrival. The sheriff himself was a large man in his 60s, grey-haired and barrel-chested, wearing a uniform that looked professionally tailored. He rose from behind an impressive mahogany desk as Eli entered, his smile warm and welcoming. "Mr. Mercer, what a pleasure. I don't believe we've met officially, though I certainly remember the tragedy of your wife's passing. Please have a seat. What can I do for you today?" Eli settled into the offered chair, studying Mitchell's face for any sign of recognition or concern. The sheriff's manner was smooth, practiced, the kind of confidence that came from years of controlling conversations and managing perceptions. "I've been looking into some old records," Eli began carefully, "going through my wife's papers, trying to understand some things about her death that never quite made sense to me." Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but Eli caught a subtle shift in his posture, a slight tensing around the eyes. "That was a long time ago, Mr. Mercer. Sometimes it's better to let the past rest, especially when it involves painful memories. I found some interesting documents," Eli continued, ignoring the warning. "Mining permits, geological surveys, correspondence about mineral rights. It seems my wife was sitting on quite a valuable property." Now Mitchell's smile faded entirely. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him in a gesture that was probably meant to look thoughtful, but came across as calculating. "Mr. Mercer, I'm going to speak plainly with you. You're an old man, living alone on a remote ranch. Sometimes isolation can lead to misunderstandings about past events. Frank Morrison doesn't think they were misunderstandings. The mention of the former sheriff's name hit Mitchell like a physical blow. His face went pale, then flushed red with anger. For a moment, the mask of professional courtesy slipped completely, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "Frank Morrison is a bitter old man whose memory isn't what it used to be," Mitchell said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "He's been spinning fantasies about conspiracy theories for years. I wouldn't put much stock in anything he tells you." Eli reached into his jacket and pulled out one of the crime scene photographs Frank had given him, sliding it across the desk. It showed the blue paint fragments found near Sarah's truck, evidence that had never been mentioned in any official report. Mitchell glanced at the photograph, and this time he couldn't hide his reaction. His hands clenched into fists, And when he looked up at Eli, his eyes held the kind of cold calculation that comes with years of getting away with terrible things. "Where did you get this? Does it matter? What matters is that my wife was murdered, and you helped cover it up." Mitchell stood slowly, his considerable bulk making the movement seem like a threat. He walked to the window behind his desk, looking out at the parking lot where Eli's truck sat in the afternoon sun. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Mercer. The kind that could get a man in serious trouble if he couldn't back it up with more than old photographs and the rambling of a senile ex-sheriff." "I can back it up," Eli said quietly. "I have the real geological surveys, the mining permits, Margaret Hawthorne's correspondence. I know about the $47 million in mineral deposits. I know about the pattern of deaths among property owners who wouldn't sell." Mitchell turned from the window, and now his mask was completely gone. The man looking at Eli was a predator who'd been cornered, dangerous and calculating. "You know what I think, Mr. Mercer? I think you're a lonely old man who's been living in a fantasy for 30 years, trying to make sense of a tragic accident by turning it into some elaborate conspiracy. I think you should go home, tend to your animals, and stop bothering people with these delusions. And if I don't..." Mitchell walked back to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a sheriff's badge, not his current one, but an older style that Eli recognized from the 1990s. He set it on the desk between them like a gauntlet being thrown down. "This belonged to my uncle," Mitchell said. "Deputy Sheriff Ray Mitchell. He died in 1998, 3 years after your wife's accident. Lung cancer, officially. But the truth is, he died of guilt and fear. He couldn't live with what he'd been part of, what he'd been forced to do." Mitchell picked up the badge, turning it over in his hands. "Ray told me everything before he died. About the pressure from state officials, about the threats against his family, about the choice between cooperation and consequences. He chose cooperation, and it ate him alive." The sheriff's eyes met Eli's, and in them was the cold certainty of someone who'd made peace with terrible choices. "I won't make the same mistake my uncle did. I won't let guilt destroy me, and I won't let some old rancher with delusions of justice threaten everything I've built. You're threatening me. I'm advising you. Accidents happen, Mr. Mercer, especially to elderly people living alone in remote areas. Fires, falls, medical emergencies, so many ways an old man could meet an unfortunate end. And sometimes, even faithful dogs can't protect their masters from the dangers of isolated ranch life." The mention of Dusty sent a chill through Eli's blood. These people had already tried to kill his dog once, 30 years ago. The threat wasn't idle. It was a promise backed by decades of violence and corruption. Eli stood slowly, pocketing the photograph and leaving the badge on Mitchell's desk. "I understand your position, Sheriff, and I hope you understand mine. My wife died for the truth, and I won't let her death be meaningless." Mitchell's laugh was cold and humorless. "Your wife died because she didn't know when to quit. I'd hate for you to make the same mistake." As Eli walked toward the door, Mitchell called after him. "Mr. Mercer, that evidence you think you have, it won't be enough. 30 years of careful management have made sure of that. And the people behind this operation have resources you can't imagine. They've been planning for the possibility of exposure since the beginning." Eli paused at the door, but didn't turn around. "Maybe, but they made one mistake 30 years ago, and they just made another one today." "What mistake is that?" "They let me live. The drive home seemed longer than usual. Every curve in the mountain road a potential ambush. Every vehicle in his rearview mirror a possible threat. But Eli's fear was tempered by a cold anger that had been building for 30 years. Mitchell's threats had confirmed everything. Sarah's murder, the cover-up, the ongoing corruption that had stolen their life together. When he finally reached the ranch, Dusty was waiting by the door, his tail wagging despite the bandage on his leg. But as Eli approached, the dog's demeanor changed. Dusty's ears went back, and he began to growl low in his throat, looking past Eli toward the ridge where the cottonwood trees lined the drive. Someone had been here. Eli could feel it in the way Dusty held himself, in the subtle signs that only someone who'd lived with the dog for years would recognize. The house looked undisturbed, but that didn't mean much. Professionals would know how to search without leaving obvious traces. Inside, Eli went straight to the kitchen drawer where he kept Henrik's old .45. The gun was still there, along with a box of ammunition that was probably older than some of the deputies on Mitchell's force. He checked the cylinder, loaded 6 rounds, and set the gun on the kitchen table where he could reach it quickly. Then he sat down to plan. Mitchell was right about one thing. The evidence Eli had collected might not be enough to bring down a conspiracy with 30 years of careful planning behind it. But Sarah had been gathering evidence too, and according to her journal, she'd hidden copies of everything in a place only Eli would think to look. It was time to find out what secrets his wife had left for him, and whether those secrets would be enough to finally bring justice for her murder. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and setting the cottonwood leaves to whispering like voices from the past. Dusty settled at Eli's feet, still alert, but trusting in his master's protection. Together, they would face whatever came next. They'd already survived 30 years of silence and isolation. Now it was time to break that silence, no matter what the cost. Eli spent the evening checking and rechecking the doors and windows, installing additional locks and positioning makeshift alarms that would alert him to any intrusion. Dusty followed him through the house, the dog's protective instincts fully awakened after the confrontation with Sheriff Mitchell. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger. Every sound from outside might signal the approach of men who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. But as the night wore on and no attack came, Eli's thoughts turned to Sarah's final journal entry. "I've hidden copies of everything in the place only Eli would think to look. Dusty knows the way." For 30 years he'd assumed those words were merely the desperate hope of a woman who sensed her time was running out. Now he wondered if they might be something more, a literal clue to evidence that could finally bring justice. Where would Sarah hide something that only he would think to look? And what role could Dusty play in finding it? The dog was old now, but his memory remained sharp. Dogs could remember scents and locations for years, decades even. If Sarah had trained him to lead someone to a specific place, would he still remember after all this time? Unable to sleep, Eli found himself drawn back to Sarah's office upstairs. He'd been through her papers, but perhaps there was something he'd missed, some clue hidden in plain sight. The room felt different in the darkness, filled with shadows and memories that seemed more vivid in the quiet hours before dawn. He turned on the desk lamp and began a more methodical search, checking every drawer, every folder, every space where something might be concealed. Sarah had been meticulous in her record-keeping, but she'd also been clever. If she'd hidden something important, it wouldn't be in an obvious place. It was while examining the desk itself that Eli noticed something odd. The bottom drawer on the right side seemed shallower than the others, as if it didn't extend fully to the back of the desk. He pulled the drawer out completely and discovered a narrow gap between the drawer bottom and the back panel of the desk. His fingers found a small catch hidden beneath the desk's edge, and when he pressed it, a secret compartment opened with a soft click. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a slim journal, bound in brown leather. Eli's hands trembled as he lifted it out, recognizing Sarah's careful handwriting on the cover. For Eli, the truth. He opened the journal to the first page, dated 6 months before Sarah's death, and began to read. What he found there shattered everything. He thought he knew about his wife's final months, and the events that followed. The first entries detailed Sarah's growing awareness of the conspiracy surrounding their land. She wrote about the falsified geological surveys, the pattern of suspicious deaths among neighboring ranchers, and her discovery of the mining permits that revealed the true value of their property. But as the entries progressed, they revealed a plan so audacious and desperate that Eli could barely believe what he was reading. March 15th, 1995. I know they're planning to kill me. The threats are becoming more direct, and I've seen the same car following me 3 times this week. Eli thinks I'm being paranoid, but I've done the research. Every property owner who's refused to sell has met with an accident within months. Tom Bradley's hunting trip, Ruth Kensington's heart attack, none of it is coincidental. March 22, 1995. I've been in contact with a federal agent named Sarah Chen, using Dorothy's maiden name as cover. She's working undercover to investigate the corruption in the State Mining Commission. We've developed a plan that's risky, but might be our only chance to gather the evidence needed to bring down the entire operation. Eli paused, his heart pounding. A federal agent? Sarah had been working with federal law enforcement, but there was more, and as he read on, the true scope of his wife's plan became clear. April 10th, 1995. Agent Chen has arranged for a witness. Protection scenario, but it requires staging my death convincingly enough to fool the conspirators while allowing me to continue gathering evidence from the shadows. It means leaving Eli behind, at least temporarily, and the thought breaks my heart. But if we can expose the truth, we can save not just our land but all the families who've been victimized by this conspiracy. The entries detailed an elaborate plan involving a staged accident, a substitute body obtained from a morgue in Denver, and Sarah's relocation to a safe house where she could continue her investigation. Agent Chen had connections in the coroner's office who would ensure the body was cremated quickly, preventing any detailed examination that might reveal the deception. August 30th, 1995. Everything is in place. The hardest part will be leaving Eli without being able to explain. He'll grieve, and I'll have to watch from a distance while he suffers. But it's the only way to keep him safe. The people behind this conspiracy won't hesitate to kill anyone who knows the truth. September 14th, 1995. Tomorrow is the day. I've prepared everything. The evidence is hidden in the old mine shaft on the North 40, exactly where Margaret Hawthorne suggested. I've trained Dusty to respond to a specific whistle sequence that will lead whoever follows him to the right location. If something goes wrong, if I don't survive this charade, at least there's a chance the truth will come out eventually. The final entry was dated the morning of September 15th, 1995, the day Sarah supposedly died. I'm terrified, but I'm also hopeful. This might be the last time I write in this house, the last time I see Eli's face before I disappear from his life. I've left him a letter explaining everything, hidden in a place he'll find when he's ready for the truth. I pray that someday we'll be reunited, that justice will prevail, and that the land we've fought so hard to protect will remain in the family where it belongs. Eli set the journal down, his mind reeling from the implications. Sarah might still be alive. For 30 years, he'd mourned a wife who might have been living in hiding, working to gather evidence that could bring down her killers. The grief, the loneliness, the guilt, all of it based on a deception designed to protect him and advance the cause of justice. But if Sarah was alive, where was she now? And what had happened to her investigation? 30 years was a long time for someone to remain hidden, especially someone working to expose a conspiracy with resources and connections throughout state government. Eli read through the journal again, looking for clues about Sarah's intended hiding place or the federal agent who'd helped her. There were references to safe houses in other states, mentions of a new identity that had been prepared, but nothing specific enough to provide a trail he could follow. Then he found the letter Sarah had mentioned, another piece of oilcloth containing a sealed envelope addressed to him in her familiar handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing pages of explanation and love that brought tears to his eyes. "My dearest Eli," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means my plan has either succeeded or failed catastrophically. Either way, you deserve to know the truth about what happened to me and why I had to leave you behind." Sarah's letter detailed the same plan outlined in her journal, but with more personal reflection on the emotional cost of her decision. She wrote about watching him from a distance in the weeks after her supposed death, seeing his grief and wanting desperately to comfort him, but knowing that any contact would endanger both of them. "I've seen how this conspiracy destroys families, Eli. I won't let them destroy ours. By disappearing, I can protect you while continuing to gather evidence. When we have enough proof to ensure convictions, I'll contact you through Agent Chen. Until then, you must go on living as if I'm truly gone." The letter concluded with instructions about the evidence hidden in the mine shaft and a detailed description of the whistle sequence that would cause Dusty to lead him there. But it was the final paragraph that broke Eli's heart and gave him hope in equal measure. "I love you more than life itself, Eli. Everything I'm doing is to protect that love and the future we plan together. Don't grieve for me. I'm not gone, just hidden. And someday, when justice has been served, I'll come home to you." Eli sat in the darkened room, holding his wife's letter and trying to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. Sarah might be alive. Somewhere she might be waiting for word that it was safe to return home. But 30 years was a long time, and the conspiracy she'd been fighting had grown stronger and more entrenched with each passing year. Outside, Dusty began to bark, not the alarmed warning of an intruder, but something different. Eli went to the window and saw the dog standing in the yard, looking toward the north pasture, where the old mine shaft lay hidden among the rocks and scrub pine. As he watched, Dusty tilted his head back and howled, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry across the valley like a message. A message to someone who might still be listening, someone who'd been waiting 30 years for the right moment to come home. Eli grabbed a flashlight and Henrik's old .45, then headed for the door. It was time to follow Dusty to the truth. No matter where it might lead, or what dangers waited in the darkness. After 30 years of living a lie, he was finally ready to face whatever reality his wife had hidden in the depths of the earth. The dog was already moving when Eli stepped outside, heading toward the ridge with purpose and certainty. Behind them the house stood empty and silent, holding its secrets like a patient guardian. Ahead lay answers that would either reunite a family or confirm that some truths come too late to matter. But even if it was too late, even if Sarah was truly gone, Eli would honor her sacrifice by ensuring the evidence she'd gathered finally saw the light of day. Justice delayed was not justice denied, not if he had anything to say about it. Dusty moved with surprising agility for a dog of his age, his injured leg barely slowing him as he navigated the rocky terrain toward the north pasture. Eli followed, his flashlight beam dancing across the familiar landscape that looked alien and mysterious in the pre-dawn darkness. The dog seemed to know exactly where he was going, following paths that weren't visible to human eyes, but remained clear in his canine memory after 30 years. The old mine shaft lay in a depression between two limestone ridges, hidden by scrub, pine and boulder formations that made it nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Eli had been there countless times over the years, checking on cattle or repairing fence line, but he'd never paid particular attention to the abandoned workings. The shaft itself was fenced off for safety, its entrance blocked by rusted iron bars that had kept curious animals and occasional hikers from venturing into the unstable tunnels below. But as Dusty led him closer, Eli began to notice details that had escaped his attention before. The fence around the mine entrance showed signs of careful maintenance. The posts were more secure than they should have been after decades of weather, and the rust on the iron bars looked deliberately applied rather than naturally occurring. Someone had been taking care of this place, disguising recent activity with artificial aging. Dusty stopped about 20 feet from the mine entrance and began to circle, his nose to the ground as if tracking a scent. Then he moved to a particular boulder, sat down, and began to dig at its base with his good front paw. Eli knelt beside the dog and helped clear away loose soil and debris, his fingers soon finding what Dusty had detected: a small metal box buried in the rocky ground. The box was wrapped in multiple layers of plastic to protect it from moisture, and inside, Eli found an antique brass key along with a note in Sarah's handwriting. "The lock is hidden behind the loose stone at the mine entrance, third bar from the left, 2 feet down. Be careful." The shaft is deeper than it appears. Working by flashlight, Eli examined the iron bars blocking the mine entrance until he found the one Sarah had described. Behind it, hidden in a crevice between limestone blocks, was a combination safe built into the rock wall itself. The safe was old but well maintained, its brass fittings green with age but still functional. The antique key fit perfectly, and with a satisfying click, the safe door swung open. Inside, protected by waterproof containers, was a treasure trove of evidence that took Eli's breath away. Files of documents, photographs, recorded conversations, financial records, enough material to fill several large boxes. But it was the personal letter on top, addressed to him in Sarah's handwriting, that made his hands shake as he lifted it out. "My beloved Eli," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've discovered the truth about my supposed death and found the courage to follow the clues I left behind. I pray that I'm still alive to see this moment. But if I'm not, please know that every day of our separation has been worth it if this evidence can finally bring justice for all the families who've suffered." The letter went on to explain the full scope of the conspiracy that Sarah and Agent Chen had uncovered. It reached far beyond simple land fraud. The mineral extraction operation was part of a larger scheme involving money laundering, political corruption, and environmental crimes that spanned multiple states. The people behind it had connections to organized crime, foreign investors, and politicians at the highest levels of state government. The evidence in this safe represents 5 years of careful investigation, Sarah wrote. Agent Chen and I documented every transaction, every bribe, every murder. We have recordings of conversations between the conspirators, photographs of secret meetings, and financial records showing how the stolen mineral wealth was distributed. But most importantly, we have proof of the murders, yours truly included. Eli found the murder file, a comprehensive documentation of how Sarah's death had been staged. There were photographs of the preparation, recordings of conversations with the morgue official who'd provided the substitute body, and detailed plans showing how the crime scene had been arranged to look like an accident. Agent Chen had worn a wire during several meetings, capturing Sheriff Mitchell and his co-conspirators as they planned the cover-up and discussed their concerns about Sarah's investigation. But there was more. Sarah and Agent Chen had documented at least 12 other suspicious deaths over a 15-year period, all property owners who'd refused to sell their mineral-rich land. Each death had been carefully planned and executed to look accidental, with local law enforcement ensuring that investigations were cursory and quickly closed. As Eli read through the files, he began to understand the true scope of what his wife had accomplished. She hadn't just gathered evidence of a local conspiracy, she'd exposed a criminal organization that had been systematically stealing resources and murdering anyone who stood in their way. The potential prosecutions would reach from small-town sheriffs to state politicians, from mining company executives to federal judges who'd been bought and paid for. But then he found something that made his heart nearly stop. A recent letter, dated just 6 months ago, written in Sarah's unmistakable handwriting. "Eli," the recent letter began, "I know this will come as a shock, but I'm still alive. I've been living under an assumed identity in Montana, continuing to gather evidence, while Agent Chen built cases against the conspirators. We're finally ready to move forward, but we need to ensure your safety first." By the time you read this, federal agents should already be positioning themselves to make arrests throughout the conspiracy. "My part of the plan is nearly complete, and soon, very soon, I can come home." The letter was signed with the pet name Sarah had used for him in private, an endearment no one else would know. She was alive. After 30 years of grief and loneliness, his wife was alive and planning to return home. But as Eli's elation peaked, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. The recent letter was unfinished, ending mid-sentence, as if Sarah had been interrupted while writing it. and there was a dark stain on the paper that looked suspiciously like blood. His hands shaking, Eli examined the safe more carefully and found what he'd initially missed, signs of a recent break-in. The lock showed scratches from tools, and some of the files had been disturbed, their careful organization disrupted by someone searching hastily through the contents. Someone had found Sarah's hiding place. Someone had discovered her evidence and possibly found her as well. The blood on the letter suggested she'd been hurt, maybe killed, just as she was preparing to reunite with him. Eli's grief and rage threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to think clearly. If Sarah had been discovered, if she was truly gone this time, then he was the only one left who could ensure her evidence reached the right people. The conspiracy she'd spent 30 years fighting was still active, still dangerous, still stealing from families and murdering anyone who threatened their operation. But who could he trust? Sheriff Mitchell was clearly compromised, and Sarah's letters suggested the corruption reached to the highest levels of state government. Even federal agents might be unreliable. The letter mentioned that the conspiracy had connections throughout the Justice Department. Then Eli remembered Dorothy Chen at the library, and Sarah's mention of Agent Chen using Dorothy's maiden name as cover. Dorothy wasn't just the librarian who'd helped him research old newspapers. She was the federal agent who'd been working with Sarah all along. She'd been hiding in plain sight for 30 years, maintaining her cover while building cases against the conspirators. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Dorothy had been protecting him, watching over him, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth and reunite him with Sarah. But something had gone wrong in the final stages of their plan. Sarah's discovery had led to a new round of violence, and now Dorothy was the only one who could help him finish what his wife had started. Eli carefully gathered the most critical documents from the safe, sealing them in waterproof bags and hiding them in multiple locations. If the conspirators knew about the mine shaft, they might come looking for the evidence. But Sarah had been thorough in her preparations. She'd created multiple copies of everything, hidden in various locations around the ranch. As he prepared to leave the mine shaft, Dusty suddenly became alert, his ears pricked and his body tense. In the distance, Eli could hear the sound of vehicles approaching, their engines echoing off the rocky walls of the canyon. Someone was coming, and at this hour of the morning, it wasn't likely to be anyone friendly. Eli grabbed the most important files and his flashlight, then followed Dusty away from the mine entrance toward a series of caves and overhangs that honeycombed the limestone ridge. They'd played in these formations as children, and Sarah had known every hiding place and secret passage. If she'd taught Dusty the safe routes through the rocks, they might be able to evade whoever was coming for them. Behind them, vehicle doors slammed, and authoritative voices began coordinating a search. Someone had been watching the ranch, waiting for Eli to lead them to Sarah's evidence. But they were too late. The most damaging documents were already secured, and Eli knew these mountains better than any outsider ever could. As they climbed higher into the rocks, Dusty led him to a hidden cave that overlooked the mine shaft below. From this vantage point, Eli could see Sheriff Mitchell directing a team of men in tactical gear as they broke into the safe and began removing the remaining evidence. The corrupt lawman was trying to destroy the proof of his crimes, but he was 30 years too late. The truth was already out there, hidden in multiple locations, waiting for the right person to bring it to light. And Eli, guided by a faithful dog who'd carried secrets in his flesh for 3 decades, was going to make sure that person was Dorothy Chen. Justice had been delayed for 30 years, but it would not be denied. Not anymore. Not while Eli had breath in his body and evidence in his hands. Eli waited in the cave until the searchers below gave up and departed, their vehicles disappearing into the grey dawn with the futile satisfaction of men who thought they'd destroyed evidence that had already escaped their grasp. Dusty lay beside him, panting softly from their climb, but alert to any sound that might signal danger. The dog had led him well, following paths through the rocks that only someone who'd lived on this land for decades could navigate. When the canyon fell silent again, Eli made his way back to the ranch house, moving carefully and staying off the main roads. He needed to reach Dorothy Chen, Agent Chen, before Sheriff Mitchell realized that the most damaging evidence was still unaccounted for. But first, he had one more place to search. One final hiding spot that Sarah had mentioned in her letter. The old strongbox was hidden in the root cellar beneath the kitchen, sealed behind a false wall that Henrik had constructed during the Cold War, when every rancher with sense kept emergency supplies against uncertain times. Eli had forgotten about the hiding place until Sarah's letter reminded him, her instructions precise about where to find the catch that would open the concealed compartment. Inside the strongbox, wrapped in oilcloth and protected from moisture, were the original land deeds dating back to Henrik's grandfather. But more importantly, there were copies of the fraudulent documents that had been used to transfer mineral rights away from legitimate property owners. The paperwork showed a pattern of forgery and manipulation that stretched back 20 years. Each theft carefully orchestrated and legally disguised. These were the documents that proved ownership, not just of his ranch, but of dozens of properties throughout the county. Families who'd been forced to sell for fractions of their land's true value. Elderly ranchers who'd been convinced their property was worthless when it actually contained fortunes in precious metals. The strongbox held the evidence that could restore what had been stolen and ensure that the real criminals faced justice. Eli loaded everything into his truck and drove toward town, his hands steady on the wheel despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. 30 years of silence were about to end. 30 years of corruption and murder were about to be exposed. And somewhere, if she was still alive, Sarah would finally see her sacrifice vindicated. The library was just opening when Eli arrived. Dorothy Chen unlocking the front door with the same methodical precision she'd shown for decades. But when she saw him approaching with boxes of documents, her professional demeanor shifted into something sharper and more focused. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "I think we need to talk privately." She led him to her office behind the main desk, closing the door and drawing the blinds before turning to face him. In the dim light, Dorothy looked different, less like a small-town librarian and more like someone who'd spent years keeping dangerous secrets. "How long have you known?" Eli asked. "About Sarah's plan?" "From the beginning. I've been Agent Chen for 37 years, Eli. I came to Clearwater Valley specifically to investigate the mineral rights fraud, and Sarah was my primary asset. She was brave, intelligent, and absolutely determined to protect her family's land." Dorothy's revelation confirmed what Eli had suspected since finding Sarah's letters. The quiet librarian who'd helped him research newspaper articles was actually the federal agent who'd orchestrated his wife's disappearance and spent 3 decades building a case against the conspiracy. "Is she alive?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Dorothy's expression grew pained. 6 months ago, yes. We were preparing to make arrests, to bring her home and reunite your family. But something went wrong. Someone discovered our safe house in Montana. When our backup team arrived, they found signs of a struggle, but no bodies. Sarah disappeared, along with the agent who was protecting her. The confirmation of his worst fears hit Eli like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain focused. Sarah might be gone, but her evidence remained. Her sacrifice wouldn't be meaningless if he could ensure the conspiracy was finally exposed. "I have everything," he said, opening the boxes and spreading documents across Dorothy's desk. The mining permits, the geological surveys, the murder files, the financial records showing how the mineral wealth was laundered. Enough evidence to bring down everyone involved, from Sheriff Mitchell to the state politicians who enabled this conspiracy. Dorothy examined the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades building federal cases. Her expression grew more amazed as she realized the scope of what Sarah had accomplished. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "We knew about some of these crimes, but Sarah documented everything. Financial transactions we could never trace, conversations we never managed to record, evidence of murders we suspected but could never prove. This is enough to dismantle the entire operation. What happens now? Dorothy was already reaching for her phone, speed-dialing numbers that connected directly to FBI headquarters in Denver. Now we act quickly, before they realize how much evidence has survived. Federal agents are already positioned throughout the state, waiting for my signal to begin coordinated arrests. Sheriff Mitchell and his co-conspirators think they destroyed Sarah's evidence, which means they won't be expecting what's about to happen. As Dorothy spoke quietly into her phone, coordinating the operation that would finally bring justice for Sarah's murder, Eli felt a complex mix of emotions washing over him. Relief that the truth was finally coming out. Grief for the 30 years he'd lost with his wife. Anger at the criminals who'd stolen so much from so many families. And underneath it all, a deep satisfaction that Sarah's courage and sacrifice were about to be vindicated. Within an hour, the coordinated arrests began. FBI agents moved simultaneously across 3 states, taking into custody everyone from small-town deputies to state mining commissioners. Sheriff Mitchell was arrested at his office, the same location where he'd threatened Eli just days before. The mining company executives were taken from their corporate headquarters in Denver, their computers and files seized as evidence, but it was the arrest of State Attorney General Robert Blackstone that made the biggest headlines. Blackstone had been the architect of the legal framework that enabled the conspiracy, using his office to legitimize the theft of mineral rights and cover up the murders of property owners who wouldn't cooperate. His connections to organized crime and foreign money laundering operations turned a local corruption case into an international scandal. As news of the arrest spread, Eli found himself at the center of media attention he'd never wanted. Reporters called him a hero, a man who'd spent 30 years seeking justice for his murdered wife. But he knew the real hero was Sarah, whose courage and determination had made this moment possible. That evening, as federal agents continued processing evidence and making additional arrests, Eli sat on his porch with Dusty at his feet, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and red. The same colors that had blessed his wedding day 35 years ago. When the future had seemed full of promise and possibility, Sarah was gone, probably murdered when she was discovered 6 months ago, but her evidence lived on. The conspiracy that had stolen their life together was finally being dismantled, and the families who'd been victimized were finally seeing justice. It wasn't the ending Eli had hoped for when he'd discovered the truth about his wife's death, but it was the ending Sarah would have wanted, the truth exposed, the criminals punished, and the land she'd died to. Protect finally secure in the hands of its rightful owners. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne had become the center of what newspapers were calling the largest corruption case in Wyoming's history. For 3 weeks, FBI agents had been presenting evidence to a federal grand jury, unraveling 30 years of conspiracy, murder, and fraud. Eli sat in the gallery, watching as prosecutor after prosecutor laid out the case that Sarah had died building. Her courage and sacrifice finally bearing fruit in the halls of justice. Today was different, though. Today was the day the original land ownership documents would be presented. The papers that proved beyond doubt that the mineral rights had been stolen through fraud and violence. Dorothy Chen, Agent Chen, had asked Eli to be present when the evidence was revealed, both as a witness and as the rightful heir to land that was worth far more than anyone had imagined. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Martinez, called Eli to the witness stand to authenticate the documents from Henrik's strongbox. As he testified about finding the hidden papers, about his grandfather-in-law's careful preservation of the original land grants and mineral deeds, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear to everyone in the courtroom. "Mr. Mercer," Martinez said, holding up the original deed from 1892. "Can you tell the court what this document represents?" "That's the original land grant to my wife's great-grandfather, Lars Larson. It includes all mineral rights to 3,000 acres in the Devil's Canyon area, signed by the territorial governor and witnessed by the land commissioner. And this document. She held up a modern survey from Pinnacle Development. That's one of the fraudulent surveys used to convince property owners that their land contained no valuable minerals. The geological data was falsified to suppress property values. The contrast between the documents was stark. The original deed clearly established the Larson family's ownership of mineral rights that the modern surveys claimed didn't exist. When Martinez presented the true geological assessments, the ones found in Sarah's hidden safe, the gallery gasped audibly at the scope of the deception. $47 million in gold. Silver and copper had been extracted from land that rightfully belonged to families who'd been told it was worthless. The mining companies had been operating illegally for 30 years. Their profits built on stolen resources and covered up by murdered witnesses. But it was the presentation of the murder evidence that brought the conspiracy's full horror into focus. Martinez methodically detailed each suspicious death, showing how property owners who refused to sell had been systematically eliminated. Tom Bradley, Ruth Kensington, Margaret Hawthorne, James Morrison, all murdered for refusing to participate in the theft of their own heritage. And Sarah Mercer? Martinez asked, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. Sarah Mercer was murdered because she discovered the truth and was preparing to expose it. The evidence shows that her death was planned and executed by a conspiracy that reached from local law enforcement to the highest levels of state government. Sheriff Mitchell, former State Attorney General Blackstone, and 7 mining company executives sat at the defendant's table, their faces reflecting the knowledge that their crimes had finally caught up with them. 30 years of careful planning, bribery, and murder had been undone by the courage of one woman and the faithfulness of an old dog who'd carried secrets in his flesh until the time was right. When the prosecution finished presenting its case, the defense attorneys attempted to minimize their clients' roles, to paint them as small players in a larger conspiracy they'd never fully understood. But the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's recordings captured them planning murders and discussing how to divide the stolen wealth. Her documents traced every bribe, every falsified report, every moment of corruption that had made their crimes possible. The grand jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning indictments against all 37 defendants. Charges ranging from murder and conspiracy to money laundering and violations of federal mining law. The conspiracy that had seemed untouchable for 30 years crumbled in a single afternoon of justice. Outside the courthouse, Eli found himself surrounded by reporters and representatives from other families who'd been victimized by the conspiracy. The Bradley's son had driven from Colorado to thank him for exposing his father's murder. Ruth Kensington's daughter wept as she described finally knowing the truth about her mother's death, but it was the representative from the Northern Cheyenne Nation who put the victory in its proper perspective. The tribal lawyer explained that much of the stolen land had originally belonged to the tribe before being fraudulently transferred to mining companies in the 1970s. The federal prosecution would restore not just the Larson Ranch to its rightful owners, but thousands of acres of sacred land to the people who'd been its guardians for generations. Your wife died protecting more than just your ranch, the lawyer told Eli. She died protecting the heritage of everyone who'd been victimized by this conspiracy. Her courage saved land that belongs to all of us. As the crowd dispersed and the media attention faded, Eli found himself alone with Dorothy Chen on the courthouse steps. The federal agent who'd spent 30 years seeking justice looked tired but satisfied, her mission finally complete. What happens now? Eli asked. Now comes the hard part, Dorothy replied. The civil litigation to recover the stolen wealth, the environmental cleanup of illegally mined land, the process of returning property to its rightful owners. But the criminal conspiracy is finished. The people who killed Sarah and all the others will spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. Eli looked out at the Wyoming landscape. thinking about Sarah and all she'd sacrificed to reach this moment. The land was safe now, protected by law and justice instead of secrecy and violence. The mineral wealth that had been stolen would be used to restore what had been damaged and compensate the families who'd been victimized. She knew, he said quietly. Sarah knew that defeating this conspiracy was worth any sacrifice, even our life together. She chose justice over happiness, truth over safety. She chose love, Dorothy corrected. Love for you, love for the land, love for future generations who deserve to inherit something better than lies and corruption. Everything she did was an act of love. As they prepared to part ways, Dorothy handed Eli a final envelope, one that had been held as evidence during the trial, but was now being returned to him. This was found in the safe house where Sarah was taken, she said. We believe she was writing it when they discovered her location. Eli opened the envelope with trembling hands and found a letter in Sarah's familiar handwriting dated just 6 months ago. But this letter was different from the others. It was filled with hope and anticipation. The words of a woman who believed she was finally coming home. My darling Eli, it began. By the time you read this, the arrests will be complete and justice will finally be served. I'm coming home, my love. After 30 years of separation, 30 years of fighting in the shadows, I'm finally coming home to you. The letter was unfinished, ending abruptly in the middle of a sentence about the future they would build together. But even incomplete, it carried the promise of a love that had endured decades of separation and sacrifice, a love that had been stronger than death itself. Sarah was gone, but her love remained in the land she'd protected, in the justice she'd achieved, and in the heart of the man who'd never stopped believing in the power of truth to overcome even the darkest conspiracy. 6 months after the trials ended, Eli stood in the kitchen where everything had begun, watching the morning light filter through windows that Sarah had chosen and hung with curtains she'd sewn by hand. The house felt different now, not empty but peaceful, as if the ghosts of unanswered questions had finally been laid to rest. Dusty lay in his familiar place by the wood stove, moving more slowly each day, but still alert to every sound and shadow that might signal change. The ranch had been restored to its full 3,000 acres, the federal court having voided all the fraudulent transfers and returned stolen land to its rightful owners. The mineral wealth that had been extracted illegally would be used to fund environmental restoration and compensation for the families who'd been victimized. Eli found himself the sole owner of property worth far more than he could have imagined, but the money felt less important than the justice that had finally been served. Representatives from various environmental groups had approached him about selling or donating the land for conservation purposes. The Nature Conservancy offered to purchase the ranch at full market value and maintain it as a wildlife preserve. The Northern Cheyenne Nation expressed interest in restoring traditional management practices to land that had been in their stewardship for generations before white settlement. But Eli hadn't made any decisions yet. At 78, he was too old to work the ranch as it had been worked in Henrik's time, too tired to fight any more battles over land and legacy. Sarah's sacrifice had saved the ranch from criminals and corporations, but it hadn't answered the question of what should happen to it next. The answer came, as many important answers do, from an unexpected source. Eli was grooming Dusty on the front porch, something the old dog still enjoyed despite his arthritis and the lingering tenderness around his healed wound. As he worked the brush through Dusty's graying coat, his fingers encountered something unusual on the dog's collar, a small metal plate he'd never noticed before. Hidden beneath the dog's thick fur, the plate was engraved with words that made Eli's heart catch in his throat. For Eli, with all my love, Sarah, the land remembers, and so do I. Eli removed the collar with gentle hands, studying the inscription that had been hidden against Dusty's neck for years, perhaps decades. Sarah had left him one final message: carried by the faithful companion who'd never forgotten his mission as keeper of secrets and guardian of truth. But there was more. On the reverse side of the plate, in smaller script, was an address in Helena, Montana, followed by the words, "When you're ready to let go." She'll be waiting. Eli sat heavily in his porch chair, the collar in his hands and Dusty pressing against his legs in comfort. Could it be possible? Could Sarah have survived after all, living quietly in Montana while her evidence brought down the conspiracy she'd spent 30 years fighting? The rational part of his mind said no. Agent Chen had confirmed that Sarah was almost certainly dead, killed when her safe house was discovered 6 months ago. But the hopeful part of his heart, the part that had never quite given up believing in miracles, wondered if his wife might have escaped one final time, might be waiting somewhere for word that it was safe to come home. He thought about Helena, about the 3-hour drive through mountain passes that would take him to an address that might hold nothing but disappointment. Then he thought about the alternative, spending whatever years remained to him wondering what might have been, carrying regrets that were heavier than any truth could ever be. Dusty whimpered softly and licked his hand, as if understanding the magnitude of the decision his master faced. The old dog had carried secrets faithfully for years, had led Eli to the truth when the time was right, had served as the bridge between past and present that made justice possible. Now he seemed to be encouraging one final journey, one last act of faith in love's ability to survive even the longest separation. Eli called the number Agent Chen had given him, reaching her at the FBI field office, where she'd returned to active duty after 30 years undercover. "Dorothy," he said when she answered, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there any possibility, any chance at all, that Sarah might still be alive?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Eli's heart began to race. When Dorothy finally spoke, her voice carried a weight he'd never heard before. "Eli, there are things about that night in Montana that never made sense to me. We found signs of a struggle, blood, evidence that Sarah had been taken. But we never found a body, never found any physical proof that she was actually killed. The assumption was that her captors disposed of the remains, but there could be another explanation. There could be. Sarah was resourceful, intelligent, trained in evasion techniques. If anyone could escape from a dangerous situation and disappear completely, it would be her. But Eli, you have to understand, even if she's alive, even if she escaped, there's no guarantee she would have stayed in one place. She might have gone into deep hiding, might be anywhere in the world by now." Eli looked down at the address on Dusty's collar, hope and fear warring in his chest. "I think I know where she might be." 3 days later, Eli loaded Dusty into the truck and began the drive to Helena. The old dog seemed to understand that this journey was different, more important than their usual trips to town or visits to neighboring ranches. He sat alert in the passenger seat, watching the landscape change from Wyoming plains to Montana mountains with the intensity of someone returning to familiar territory. The address led to a small house on the outskirts of Helena, surrounded by garden beds that showed the careful attention of someone who understood plants and seasons. Eli parked across the street and sat in his truck for long minutes, gathering courage and preparing for whatever he might find behind that ordinary-looking door. When he finally knocked, the woman who answered was older than the Sarah of his memories, her hair silver instead of brown, her face marked by years of worry and separation. But her eyes were exactly as he remembered them, warm and intelligent and filled with love that distance and time had been powerless to diminish. "Hello, Eli," Sarah said, her voice carrying 30 years of longing and hope. "I've been waiting for you to find me." Behind him, Dusty barked once, not in alarm but in recognition and joy. The faithful dog had completed his final mission, had carried his secrets across decades and through dangers until the moment was right for truth and love to be reunited. As Eli stepped across the threshold and into his wife's arms, he understood at last what Henrik had meant about land having memory. The ranch remembered Sarah's love and sacrifice. Dusty remembered his training and his purpose, and love itself remembered how to heal even the deepest wounds, how to restore what seemed lost beyond recovery. The conspiracy was defeated, the criminals punished, the land restored to its rightful stewardship. But more than that, a family separated by necessity and sacrifice had found its way back together, guided by the faithfulness of an old dog who never forgot that some secrets are worth keeping until the perfect moment arrives for them to be revealed. In the end, that was Sarah's greatest victory, not just the exposure of corruption or the protection of land, but the preservation of love through 30 years of separation, 30 years of hope that someday, somehow, they would find their way back to each other. The land remembers, Sarah had written. And so, despite everything, does the heart.